The man you're looking at fell victim to something that very few people ever experience, a polar bear attack, and not only that, there was more than one. In this video, I'm going to be discussing a series of disturbing things that have happened around the world, with a focus on cases that you most likely have never heard of. And brace yourselves because this one's pretty bad. So, I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. "34-year-old Christopher Best grew up in Goose Bay in Newfoundland and Labrador. At the time of this story, he was working at a remote Arctic installation. He was doing interim work with a fuel tank cleaning crew while he waited for security clearance for a more permanent position. And over the years, Christopher had done a little bit of everything. He worked as a custodian at radar sites, he did general labor, he cleaned barbecues in Toronto, and even worked as an assistant on the reality show Alone. But his real passion was always photography, especially wildlife photography. See, he kept active social media accounts where he shared his work, and bears were some of his favorite subjects. He was known to be very confident, and he believed he understood the risks that came with working in a remote place around wild animals. He had worked at other radar installations in remote Arctic places, but these were inland sites where bears were never really ever seen, and it was common for workers to take hikes after their shifts with no real concern. But see, the site that he was on this time was quite a bit different. On August 7th, 2024, Christopher arrived at an island in Nunavut about 200 kilometers southeast of Iqaluit. He was there to work at a North Warning System radar installation known as BAF-3. For context, the North Warning System is a network of 49 radar stations running from Alaska all the way over to Labrador, and they monitor airspace for NORAD. And Christopher was working for a company who manages these remote sites. Now, the island that he was on was nothing like the inland locations where Christopher had worked previously. This place, which is a rocky granite island, had serious polar bear activity. Just a year before, in 2023, his company killed what they called a problem bear at this exact site after it kept trying to get into the buildings and nothing else worked to deter it. The polar bear threat here was so persistent that workers were actually allowed to smoke inside near exhaust fans just so they wouldn't have to step out there. And on his very first day at the site, Christopher spotted a bear near the facility. Instead of seeing this as a warning, he saw it as an opportunity. He took photos from inside a vehicle and posted one to Instagram with a caption about a polar bear hanging around the site. And it's interesting because after this, his stepfather called and expressed concern, but Christopher told him not to worry, that the bears were not that close, and that he knew the difference between a safe situation and a dangerous one. He had also asked the wildlife monitor on site, an employee whose specific job was managing bear safety, to let him know whenever bears were nearby so he could photograph them. The monitor agreed to do that, but only if Christopher was extra cautious. The following day, so August 8th, 2024, at the end of the work shift, the wildlife monitor found Christopher and told him there was a bear outside. So Christopher excitedly grabbed his camera and headed out through a door that had a large warning sign about polar bears on it. He believed the bear was off in the distance, far enough away to photograph it safely. He walked around the corner of the building, and that's when everything went wrong. It turns out that there was a second polar bear much closer than the first, and nobody had told him it was there, presumably because they didn't know either. The second bear cut off his path back to the building and immediately charged at him. He took Christopher down, and then moments later, the other bear joined in. A worker saw this happening through a garage door window and yelled for a gun. But there was no gun in this building. So he ran to the accommodation building and got the wildlife monitor, who came back with a 12 gauge. Following protocol, the monitor fired a non-lethal round called a bear banger first, which is meant to scare the animals off. And both bears did run initially, but then one of them turned around and charged directly at the monitor. He had no choice but to fire a lethal shot, and he killed this bear. Around this time, another employee showed up with a weapon and stood guard while co-workers loaded Christopher into a truck and brought him inside. Christopher Best did not survive this double polar bear attack. Early the next morning, an RCMP officer went to Shelley Cox's door in Goose Bay to tell her what had happened. She later said that she stayed up all night just waiting for someone else to wake up so she could notify the family. A private memorial service was held on August 26 at the United Church in Happy Valley, Goose Bay. I just want to clear something up too. The day before, he did post these photos of polar bears on his Instagram page. But the truth is, we just don't know if these are the exact bears that ended up taking his life. And I could have built the entry around this, but it wouldn't have been true. The only source that says that is World Star Hip Hop, and yeah, I'm not taking them seriously at all. No credible sources said that. And the report doesn't include it either. I think just the fact that this could have been the bear makes it even creepier. This was the first time in roughly 70 years of operations at these radar installations that anybody had been killed by a bear. 3 separate investigations were opened after the incident, and by November of 2024, more than 3 months after this happened, none of them had been completed and nothing had been released to the public. The most detailed information at that point had come from his company's own internal investigation, which the Canadian press obtained. That report confirmed Christopher had gone through polar bear awareness training, but some of the documentation proving he completed it was missing. It also revealed a detail I already told you, which was that there was no firearm available in the building where he had been working, which is why there was a delay in the response. The report also acknowledged that this island had far more bear encounters than the inland sites where Christopher had worked before, and it did raise questions about whether anyone had properly explained to him just how different this location was. The company proposed a number of safety changes. The first was requiring workers to get supervisor permission before going outside after hours. The second was installing a public address system to announce when bears were in the area. And the third was putting up fencing around camp areas and adding motion sensor alarms. Whether any of this has actually been done remains unknown. The federal investigation has not announced any fines or penalties, even with all the safety gaps that were identified. Christopher Best left behind his mother and stepfather, his father and stepmother, 2 grandmothers, an aunt and uncle, his brother Nathan, and a wide circle of family and friends who cared about him. Rest in peace to him. This entire thing is just tragic. The 21-year-old woman at the center of this story is named Julie Tennant. She's from Northern Ireland, and in August of 2000, she was struggling quite a bit. She dealt with depression, and she had an addiction problem, but she was actively trying to get her life back together. In fact, just before the events we're about to get into, she was discharged from a hospital where she was receiving treatment for her addiction. But she was still young, her family loved her deeply, and they knew she could get through this. Her parents were Billy and Eilish Tennant. Yes, that's true, but the spelling's different, and she had 5 sisters. Julie would have, of course, been more vulnerable at this time. I mean, she just got discharged. But what this poor girl was about to experience was something that nobody could have ever predicted, and just a fair warning, it's pretty bad. Just after midnight on what would now be August 5th, 2000, Julie left her family home without her medication, money, or any spare clothing. We don't know why she left her family home, but given the circumstances, there may have been some sort of argument or something because they did see her leave. She went out partying in Ballymena and ended up with a group of men before going back to a house with them hours later. Witnesses still recalled seeing her out around 2 or 3 in the morning, so this must have been very late. So she went back to the home with the men, and while there, she met a man named Adrian Hayes. Adrian was a 28-year-old man from a nearby village who had a pretty bad reputation. He was a thief, he regularly broke into places, and he had a history of stalking and threatening women. Adrian offered Julie to come back to his place with him, telling her that he had drugs in his possession. For someone who was battling addiction and was having a terrible night, this was exactly the wrong thing to hear from exactly the wrong person. Julie eventually left with him and walked to his home with him on Warden Street, having no idea that she would never leave this house alive. At some point after they arrived at the house, Adrian tried making a move on Julie, but Julie rejected his advances and tried to leave. This completely set off Adrian, and he took her down in the hallway, later claiming that he struck her for 20 minutes straight. A neighbor also testified that they heard sounds coming from the house but thought it was an animal whimpering. After this, Adrian simply just walked into his living room, turned up the television and stereo, and tried to drown out the noise. This also didn't work, which further infuriated him, and then he got another horrible idea. He grabbed a tube of superglue, sealed her lips shut, and then simply walked back into the living room again and fell asleep. He would later tell detectives that her cries were, quote, doing his head in, and that he wanted to keep her quiet. When he woke up, the 21-year-old who had been trying so hard to get her life back together was deceased. The COD was suffocation. He wrapped Julie and put her in his garden shed, and then called his estranged wife to arrange a trip a couple hours away for that Saturday. And he went on this outing with her while Julie laid in the shed. He later returned, and on the Sunday night, he waited for darkness, loaded her remains into the boot of his car, and drove to an isolated spot where he buried her in a shallow grave. Pretty quickly, Julie's parents reported her missing, and police began piecing together witness accounts of her final movements. They traced her to Adrian Hayes' residence and sealed off his home for a forensic investigation. And when Adrian learned that police were searching his residence, he fled to England to stay with a relative. It was a pretty critical mistake because he told someone that he was going to do this, and then they alerted authorities once they heard what was going on. And on the night of August 23rd, Adrian Hayes was arrested in Dover, and the following day at around noon, the RUC Mountain Rescue Team discovered Julie's remains in the shallow grave. In February of 2002, Adrian pleaded not guilty and forced the Tennant family to endure a 9-day trial. Fortunately, the jury did find him guilty of murder. And on March 8, 2002, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. The judge condemned what he called the pitiless humiliation Hayes had inflicted on Julie and noted that the killer had yet to show any remorse for his actions. Adrian stood expressionless in the dock throughout the entire sentencing, offering nothing to the family that he had just destroyed. Her parents, along with 2 of her sisters, attended this sentencing and clung to each other while staring at him. In the years that followed, Hayes converted to Christianity in prison and even got engaged to a woman he met through prison church visits, though this engagement was later called off. In 2008, he appeared in a BBC documentary series about prison life, and Julie's mother, Eilish, spoke publicly about her ongoing pain. She pointed out that Hayes had never apologized for Julie's murder and said that him being featured in this documentary resurrected a lot of anguish. And just to make things that much worse, the family would suffer another devastating blow in 2015 when Julie's younger sister, Caroline, passed away suddenly at just 22 years old. And this is probably going to piss you off, but Adrian Hayes won a legal challenge regarding his prison release arrangements in 2017, and he was released in late 2022 after serving approximately 22 years. He has still never publicly apologized to the Tennant family, and he's just out there living his life. Or at least he was. He went back in for failing to disclose to his girlfriend details about his past. This one is just all around absolutely horrific. Julie Tennant was a young woman who was genuinely trying to overcome her struggles and build a better life for herself, and it's devastating that she had to come across this monster at the worst possible time. This case was recommended to me along with a couple others by a commenter in the pinned comment of my last video, or maybe it was 2 videos ago, and when I read this, I was very shocked that this hasn't been spoken about internationally. At first, I wasn't even sure if this was real just based on how bad the description was, but it is indeed completely real. Rest in peace to poor Julie, and my heart is with her family. The story begins in late 1997 with a man named Ralph Guarino. Ralph, to put it frankly, was in serious trouble. He reportedly owed a significant debt to a Gambino family loan shark, his girlfriend was demanding expensive Manhattan accommodations, and his petty thefts and low-level truck hijackings weren't even close to covering his overhead. Ralph was an associate of the DeCavalcanti crime family, the so-called Six family that operated out of northern New Jersey, but he wasn't actually a made man, he was just a low-level hustler. He was even a struggling actor. He'd appeared in a 1972 film and continued to look for acting jobs. This sounds really familiar. Ralphie eventually did come up with a huge idea. If he was looking for a major score, he had a friend named Salvatore who was in exactly the right place. Salvatore had worked at the World Trade Center for nearly 20 years. He had a trusted employee badge, intimate knowledge of the building's security measures, and most importantly to Ralph, he knew about the money. Every morning at precisely 8:30 a.m., a Brinks armored truck delivered bags of currency to the Bank of America Exchange Center on the 11th floor of the North Tower. Millions in mixed currencies rolled through here daily. Salvatore knew the exact timing, the exact floor, and the exact elevator that these Brinks truck drivers took. The thing is, after the 1993 bombing that killed 6 people, the Port Authority had installed roughly 55 surveillance cameras throughout the complex. But Salvatore knew exactly where the gaps were, and in exchange for a cut of the proceeds, he agreed to become Ralph's inside man. From here, Ralph really just needed gunmen, but he did have a specific strategy in mind. He didn't want professionals who might demand equal cuts or challenge his authority, so instead, he deliberately recruited what investigators would later call undesirables, desperate men who he could control through fear. He found his lead man, Richard, who was a 39-year-old from Windsor Terrace in Brooklyn. This man was a crack cocaine user with a lengthy arrest record and no stable work. From here, Richard brought in 2 friends from his neighborhood, Melvin Folk and Michael Reed. Folk was 44 and struggled with alcoholism, and Reed was 34 and battled a heroin addiction. None of these three had organized crime connections, but also none of them were exactly sophisticated criminals, and that was exactly the point. Ralph selected them because they were expendable, and they'd believe every single word that he said. And so, the plan was set in place, and on the morning of Wednesday, January 14th, the three robbers entered the North Tower dressed in winter clothes, blending into the stream of over 100,000 people who passed through the World Trade Center complex every single day. At this point, the building had no metal detectors at its entrances, so the two handguns they carried went completely unnoticed. And shortly before 8:30, all three of these men took a passenger elevator to the 11th floor and pulled on ski masks. They were nervous, but they waited, and sure enough, moments later, the freight elevator arrived. Inside were two armed Brinks guards, some cleaning staff, and a stainless steel cart loaded with 6 bags containing millions of dollars in mixed currencies. Folk and Reed quickly drew their weapons and ordered everyone to freeze, and these guys moved pretty fast. They entered the elevator, restrained the guards and employees, and used box cutters to slash open 3 specific bags, not all 6, just 3. Port Authority later noted that this selective targeting strongly suggested inside knowledge, which in hindsight it's a pretty obvious tell. Within minutes, the crew had stuffed around $1.6 million into duffel bags. They sent the freight elevator up to an empty floor that was under construction, and then they took the passenger elevator back down to the ground. And during the descent, they removed their ski masks. Just under 20 minutes after they'd arrived, the 3 men walked through the revolving doors and disappeared into Lower Manhattan. Ralph, the mastermind, watched the whole thing from a car parked across the street. For a little bit, it seemed like they'd got off, but this very quickly fell apart. I mean, this was the World Trade Center. These guys absolutely didn't understand the full extent of their surveillance system. In fact, not only were they caught on that one CCTV camera that I showed you, there were many cameras that caught them before they took off their ski masks as well. Pretty much the entire thing was caught on camera. Because they removed their masks, Folk and Reed were clearly identifiable in multiple frames. The FBI moved very quickly and released surveillance images to every major news outlet. By the evening broadcast, just 9 hours after this robbery, Folk and Reed were identified and their faces were on television screens across not just New York, but the entire country. The reason why is that Folk made quite a critical mistake. He actually just went back to his old neighborhood in Brooklyn, where he was reportedly not well liked, and he was arrested this same night. As with Reed, a retired detective who personally knew him recognized his face on the news. He was arrested the next day at a friend's house. Crime Stoppers posted a $26,000 reward and the tips poured in. Richard lasted a bit longer. He'd fled New York on an Amtrak train headed for California, but a rail worker noticed him flashing large amounts of cash and suspected he might be a drug dealer. So when he got off in Albuquerque and was questioned by a DEA agent, he gave a fake name, George Grillo, but the agent found his real ID at the bottom of his bag. From here, a computer check revealed that he was wanted for the World Trade Center robbery, and eventually they ended up tracing him to a motel. It turns out it's the exact same one that's in Breaking Bad, which is a pretty cool fact I found out. After arriving at the motel, they noticed him in the lobby, chased him, and arrested him. He was reportedly tired and just ready to give up. The FBI had immediately recognized that these 3 low-level men didn't have the intelligence or initiative to plan something this precise on their own. An interrogation of the 3 robbers led investigators straight to the mastermind. Within days of the heist, agents arrested Ralph Guarino at his Staten Island home. Facing approximately 20 years in federal prison, Ralph Guarino made a decision that would transform this robbery into one of the most significant organized crime takedowns of the decade. He agreed to become an FBI informant, and over the next 2 years, Guarino wore FBI-supplied recording devices and distributed bugged cell phones to the DeCavalcanti family members. He recorded hundreds of hours of incriminating conversations about extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and even The Sopranos.
What's this f***ing thing, Sopranos? What the f*** it is?
You never watched it?
That's what's the up?
You're in there.
Fucking there. Yeah. What'd they say?
They all sit outside the box door.
Yeah, they do.
You ever watch that route?
I caught it one night.
They're fun. What characters?
Yeah, it is.
They
You
found
gotta
these
see
guys
it.
great actors.
If you're familiar with the show like I am, you'll know that David Chase actually loosely based the DeMeo family off of the DeCavalcanti family. And all those details about Ralph definitely remind me of Christopher. This entry isn't about a TV show, so I'm going to move on. However, it's one of my favorite shows, so yeah, I had to touch on it. With FBI assistance, Ralph Guarino's status in the family really rose, and he became integral in taking down the entire family. Ultimately, approximately 45 men would be imprisoned, At this point, the family was completely dismantled, and its territory was absorbed by New York's 5 families. Guarino entered witness protection with his family, and all 3 robbers were convicted and served prison sentences, though I couldn't find any details on how long they spent in there. Salvatore, employee who'd made the whole thing possible, was charged in the December 1999 indictments, nearly 2 years after the robbery. I would say that this entire thing was a massive net negative. Guys, I'm just popping in here real quick. I was pretty sick when I recorded this entry a few weeks ago, so if I sound a bit more miserable, that's why. The story is very awful anyways though, so I feel like it does fit the mood. Let's get into it. In the spring of 2001, a small village in rural China called Fanglin Village became the center of a very disturbing situation. This village sat in the mountains about 480 miles southwest of Shanghai, and like so many poor communities in China at the time, families there lived on next to nothing. The local primary school had about 200 students, and for many of these families, education was the one shot their kids had at a better life. And on the morning of March 6, 2001, parents sent their kids to school like they did every day. The thing is, this wouldn't end up being just like any other day. See, for years, the parents of these children had been complaining. The school really wasn't functioning as a school anymore. Children as young as 8 were spending their school hours assembling fireworks, inserting fuses into firecrackers filled with gunpowder, all so that local officials and businessmen could pocket the profits. And apparently teachers enforced production targets. Kids who met them got small rewards like pencils, while those who refused were allegedly forced to kneel on the floor as punishment. One 13-year-old girl would later tell reporters they'd been doing this once or twice a week for 4 years, and the whole time, bags of gunpowder just sat there in the classrooms. Parents had gone to township authorities over and over, pleading with them to shut this down, but officials would promise to look into it and then do absolutely nothing. And on this morning, at about 11 a.m., all of these parents' concerns would be proven true. Out of nowhere, an explosion ripped through 4 classrooms on the first floor, and the blast was so powerful it shattered windows hundreds of meters away. Many parents heard the sound and came running, and one father arrived to find half the building destroyed, eventually seeing his son's clothing in the rubble and digging through it with his bare hands. Many other parents, unfortunately, had to do the same thing, pulling their children from the wreckage, and by that evening, 29 deceased people had been recovered. The official toll would reach 42. Some villagers said the real number was much higher, closer to 60. In just one 3rd grade classroom, only 3 out of 45 children made it through. One father would later walk through the village and see 4 families holding funerals outside their homes at the same time, many of them screaming that this was over nothing. In the immediate aftermath, there was confusion about what caused this explosion. As I said before, these children were spending many of their in-school hours assembling fireworks. But after this disaster, the Chinese government initially denied this. On March 8th, the premier said the school wasn't making fireworks, and instead, they blamed a 33-year-old man named Li. State media reported that Li had mental disabilities and became very unbalanced after his wife left him. Authorities claim they found a notebook where he'd written threats, and a teacher was quoted saying a man with a murderous look broke into his classroom, before placing a bag on a desk and lighting a fuse. Li also passed away in the explosion, but parents pushed back hard on this explanation. They said that Li actually worked as a laborer delivering bags of gunpowder to the school for the fireworks operation, and that he'd never shown signs of violence. The official narrative is still that Li was behind this, and many people do believe it, but there's a lot of suspicion. Around 2,000 villagers protested a few days after the explosion, demanding the truth. And under intense pressure, the premier did reverse his position on March 15th and admitted that children had been used to manufacture fireworks at the school. He expressed regret, which was notable for a Chinese leader at the time. However, he still maintained that Li had caused the explosion, while acknowledging the investigation would continue. The provincial governor reportedly resigned following the incident, and the big question was still, how was this allowed to happen? And I think we know the answer, it's just corruption. Nonetheless, families received compensation of approximately $30,000 per child, but many felt that this wasn't enough, and that the people who organized the fireworks operation weren't facing real consequences. Local officials, teachers, and businessmen who parents said had been running and profiting from the operation faced no clear public prosecution. It's worth noting that China's rural schools at this time were severely underfunded. The government had shifted education funding responsibilities, and many of these rural schools were operating commercial enterprises to raise money. Everything from farms to these sorts of manufacturing operations. In this case, the arrangement involved students assembling fireworks, with the profits going to whoever was behind it. Overall, it became a pretty widely cited example in international discussions about workers' rights and education funding. But for the families in Fanglin Village, none of this international attention would ever bring their children back. It's just a devastating tragedy. Fortunately, it seems that after this event, a lot of resources started getting allocated towards Fanglin Village, and obviously things have just changed in general, so it looks much better now. I couldn't really find too much about it though. Rest in peace to all these young individuals. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I hope everyone's had a great weekend. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I definitely do think we can still hit 100K by the end of the year, just based on the growth the last few weeks. But if not, I think I'll survive. Pretty sure. Also, I'll actually make a post about it soon, but going into the new year, I'm planning on posting every single Sunday, and then maybe once or twice a month, another one during the week. So you can still expect 5 to 6 a month.